We've been overwhelmed by registrations. We had more than 183 by close of play last night. I think we've got some more people joining as well. So it's quite an extraordinary response to this this event. It shows its importance and the huge interest. However, this does have a consequence in the sense that we'll need to move at pace in order to be able to stick to the timetable. So I'm going to ask all speakers to be as disciplined as they can in terms of their contributions, and also to ask any other contributors to keep any questions, comments, and all the rest of it as brief as possible. When we come to the workshops, we'll have a full recording of every workshop, so we will be capturing everything, so hopefully nothing will go amiss. Now, Charlie will get into this a bit more, but the key thing really is that this isn't a standalone conference. It's intended to be part of the process. And so that makes it even more important that we protect as much time as we possibly can today for the breakout workshops. And this is no disrespect to our glittering array of speakers, but actually the collective contribution from the workshops is the most important part of today. Just a few preliminary words before I hand over to Charlie. Today we're essentially talking about how communities can contribute to recovery post-pandemic and how funders can collaborate with them to make them thrive. Now, for me, the biggest prize of all here will be to finally bring the era of doing unto others to an end and to put communities in the lead. Now, we've seen a lot of interesting communities during the pandemic, and many in government and elsewhere have been looking for lessons in terms of what we can learn from the pandemic and its community response from communities. And also looked at other disasters as well to look at how we can learn from them in the past. There was a great report from the King's Fund that some people might have read that came out a couple of weeks ago, which was followed up by a conference last week in Northern Ireland. We were looking at lessons from other disasters. But for me, the most important, really interesting thing, although it was a great report, there was a really big thing missing. And that was that although the authors had spoken to people from 9/11 and all sorts of things that happened all over the world, New Orleans and all the rest of it, there was no research and no questions had clearly been asked about Northern Ireland, where we've had decades, first of all, dealing with conflict and then the aftermath from it, with communities very much at the fore. And I have to say, when I first arrived here in 1990 from Dublin, I was really struck by the power of communities and the amazing work that they did, even from things like black taxes, restorative justice, the time of the credit union movement, which is still around today. And it does seem to me that we have got really important experiences that people could learn from elsewhere. And so I hope as well that as this session today, that perhaps other people in the world might actually ask us not just about things that went well during a crisis, which is still in some respects in some communities unfolding, but what we've learned from it, what the successes and the failures were, what the obstacles have been and what the barriers are, because I think we've got quite a lot to contribute. Having said that, we've got an incredible lineup today, not just two National Community Lottery Fund people, but not just one, but two rather. We've got Kate Beggs, who's director in Northern Ireland, to be talking about how the fund has been working with communities both before, during, and as we start to enter the recovery phase of the pandemic. Joining her will be our colleague Cassie Robinson, who's been leading the UK Civil Society Approach Inquiry, and she'll be telling us about that. And she's also been fantastic in the sense that we're using her approach, or we did use an approach in order to be able to devise the workshops, which we'll be working to later on. And our keynote today is Dr. Katherine Trebeck, who founded the Global Wellbeing Economy Alliance, who'll be telling us why going back to normal after the pandemic would be a great mistake, and she'll be arguing that it should be a catalyst for radical change and the transition to a wellbeing economy. So that's what we're covering off today. And now I'm just going to hand over to Charlie Fisher to set the scene.
Thanks very much, Nick, and welcome everyone. I think Stevie, my colleague, has shared with you this morning's agenda, so you should have that in chat room function. So I just want to begin by saying on behalf of the board and staff of BDNI, to thank you all for taking time to attend this conference. You know, I'm sure it will be a benefit to you and the work of your organisation as much as Nick has said, your contribution.
Charlie, you're on mute.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
I was.
Oh, you need to mute yours. Okay, so.
My problem. Sorted. Sorry about that.
Hey, journalists, what can you do with them? And that's not a tumbleweed. I know that one's been laughed at. So we envisage that the conference is a continuation of a conversation, certainly one that we've been leading on wealth building and adding in well-being to that and the role of civil society. And we want to use this morning's event to better understand the key issues that are facing the third sector here in Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland, as we emerge from COVID. And we hope to agree at the conclusion of this morning's event, at least the key themes for further inquiry. And to support us in that, we'll prepare a detailed conference report drawing on everything that's in the chat room, everything that emerges from the Q&A, everything that goes on in the breakout sessions, and from a think piece that Katherine has prepared for us in advance of this as well. So coming out of COVID and building back better or fairer is an immense challenge for all of us. You know, the intergenerational poverty, the employment, health and wealth inequality pre-COVID continues to prevail. You know, COVID's longer-term impact will be most deeply felt, I think, by those that are on the margins of society. And by margins, I mean people on the periphery of educational achievement, those with poor health outcomes, families that are in work poverty, for example. So those already disadvantaged will be significantly challenged to experience the better or fairer society that we speak of. So rising to that challenge and creating a more equal society, I mean, is our raison d'etre as community development practitioners and those that support our work through policy and investment. For DT&I, over the past number of years, we've been leading a campaign in support of the work of community development trusts and civil society more broadly. We contend that the work of the social sector is a fundamental part of the economy. It's critical to its effective functioning. It's essential for citizens, for neighbourhoods and our region. And its contribution is more than GDP. It builds the well-being of people in place, something that hopefully Katherine will undoubtedly pick up on in her keynote address. And we started out asking by what we mean by good local economy, and supported by the Wellbeing Economics Foundation and the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. And with the many definitions and understandings that we gathered, you'll not be surprised to hear that equity and equality were always to the fore. So to help build a new economy, we've published a Charter for Change, a roadmap for community wealth, well-being and power. And I'll put the link to that document and its successor from coronavirus to community wealth into the chat box in a moment. We explored the social value return of our members and we championed the breadth of their impact through the many and varied social businesses that they own and manage. We've engaged with the economic development approach of community wealth building, and with Neil and Claes in Manchester, and more locally with Trademark, we have been impressing upon central government to adopt its principles. So our executive does have a policy in the use of land and buildings for civil society organisations, and it is to bring forward a Social Value Act, which will hopefully positively impact on public sector procurement and in turn positively impact on our sector. But we believe that more work needs to be done, and we need a step change in how we think of and how we do economy and social development. We need a new policy direction. We need structural and operational change in the third sector, the public and the private sector, and in the relationships we have within and between each other. So a new economy for wealth and well-being needs to strategically draw on, and it needs to draw in the power of community, which in turn needs to be supported with strategic and more targeted revenue and capital investment. More needs to be done to build a plural economy. We need to invest in cooperatives and community businesses, build a more participative democracy with community rights of ownership, participation and challenge. And essentially, we need a new social contract, public social partnerships, build new labour markets, and create opportunities for those that are furthest from the point of access to labour. A new economy harnessing the power of community will allow us to respond to the many challenges that confront us as a people in this place in the north of Ireland at the minute, delivering public good and responding to our many and pressing social, economic and environmental challenges. So community wealth building is concerned with maximising the impact of public finance, changing public procurement, maximising social value and building a generative wealth building economy as opposed to the orthodox dominant extractive economic development model. But I think we need to be clear as to where our community is located within community wealth building, whose community. For DT&I, community is a partner to the work of the public sector and the private sector, but it's not clear that's how it's understood in Northern Ireland. And there's a danger that it simply becomes another policy fad, something that is done to communities rather than with communities. And we need to be prepared to challenge that practice and build a much more participative and partnership approach to deliver wealth and well-being. So COVID then has made clear the importance of civil society to our well-being. And in our myriad of forums, from community associations, sports clubs, and faith-based organisations, we have been first responders, and the significance of community infrastructure to meet need in a time of crisis is now an accepted norm. You know, we have an opportunity to draw from that experience of the past year, and next point our experiences from the past 30 and 40 years, and confront afresh the inequality and exclusion, and begin to focus on the causes of that, not the symptoms. So for me, the conference provides us with an opportunity to discuss what communities want and need to deliver social justice, wealth and well-being. And as I said at the beginning, the conversation is well underway across these islands and further afield. But now we're keen to dive deeper into the inquiry areas of the UK National Lottery Community Fund civil society approach that's being led by Cassie Robinson and her team, to consider the implications of that for communities in the north and what is needed to support us on that journey. So thanks once again for your interest in the conference and committing yourself to the conversation. I'm really looking forward to the next couple of hours. I look forward to your participation, and I look forward to continue to work with you as we approach these issues together. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I'm trying to. So thank you very much indeed, Charlie. I think you've got the problem. Apologies for this, folks. I thought it would be really smart of me to come into the office this morning, because I live in Portaferry, which is quite remote and has really poor bandwidth. But I think all I've succeeded in doing is causing disruption with mute buttons and all the rest of it. So apologies. So thank you for that, Charlie, which sets the scene really well for us. I'm now going to hand over to Kate Beggs.
Thanks very much, Nick, and thanks to all of you for joining us, and to Charlie and the team at DTI for pulling this together. I think as Nick and Charlie have, a huge amount has rightly been said over the last year about the crucial role of communities and the community and voluntary sector in responding to the pandemic, and much has been said about the need to build back better and smarter and greener, and to hold on to the good things and the possibilities that have opened up, and ensure they're not lost in a return to some more recognisable form of normality. We've heard a lot about new and emerging needs, as well as particularly the exacerbated inequalities, increased levels of deprivation and mental ill health. And what we hear a bit less of, but equally clear, I think, to us, are the stories of exhaustion and burnout in the community itself and in the community sector, and the toll that some of those really heroic responses have taken on the people and organisations who were already facing a crisis for this pandemic. I think we have been, as a fund, fairly constantly amazed by the personal resilience of those people working on the ground. But part of the purpose for us, I think, of today is to identify what needs to happen to build more powerful and thriving communities so that we don't have to rely on that kind of personal resilience. Most of you, or many of you, will know that we carried out a very extensive consultation with the community and voluntary sector when we received policy directions on the Dormant Accounts Fund in 2019. And we asked what would help build capacity and resilience in the sector. At the time, obviously, unaware of the global pandemic just coming around the corner. And even then, we were hearing loud and clear that organisations just struggle to lift their heads and to think about the future, and because they were just so busy chasing, the next pot of short-term money or a whole lot of different pots of short-term money, and delivering their very essential services on a shoestring year to year. If they had that breathing space, the list of issues they said they would think about was long, and included the strategic planning, income diversification, volunteering, environmental impact, digital transformation, collaborations, and connectedness. And of course, the pandemic then brings a double whammy of not only making it even more difficult to lift heads and think about it, but at the same time making it twice as important and urgent. I think we've experienced some of the reality of that in opening the Dormant Accounts Fund at the point where we did. It's intended to provide long-term flexible funding for transformation and sustainability, but in the teeth of such short-term need and such political and social uncertainty. It's a really difficult space to occupy, the lifting of the head, and encouraging everybody to think long-term, to stop. And it's often really frustrating, I think, for everybody concerned. And as the others have said, you're going to hear from my colleague Cassie about our UK-wide approach to thinking about the future. And I'm sure she will attest as well, even internally, it's really difficult. I think it can really cause tension at times when we're sort of, trying to battle between looking to the future and dealing with the here and now. But when we speak to people in the sector and the people we fund, there is a really clear challenge that because of our size and the space we occupy between government and the community and voluntary sector, we have a responsibility as a funder to be more than money, and that we have the power to convene and share learning and stimulate partnerships and create connections and keep an eye on the future. And it was part of that conversation with Charlie and his engagement that brought us here today. As a funder, we, the principle of putting people and communities in the lead underpins absolutely everything we do. And we've reflected on the things that enabled us to respond flexibly to support communities at the outset of the pandemic, when we all found ourselves faced with, an escalating emergency with no precedent and very little frame of reference. And to be honest, it came down to trusted relationships. That was our strong connections directly to communities through a local team working model, which helped us understand what people were facing and what patterns were emerging. Our connections with other funders, which have been strengthened through closer collaboration over the last year, and particularly with the development of a stronger funders forum for Northern Ireland, which understands that by working together more closely, we can better serve communities and maximise our collective impact. And our connections with government, because as a non-departmental public body, we do occupy a unique space in that we are not an independent funder, but an arm's length body. And we have close and trusted relationships in the sector because of the way we fund, but we also have good relationships with policymakers and those who faced momentous policy challenges in COVID. So for me, all of that forms a good basis on which to look to the future and help to shape funding and services in a way which support communities to reconnect and re-emerge and rebuild in the ways that have been described. And this week we announced the first of our dormant accounts grants under the Dormant Fund, and that demonstrates that there are organisations and who are grasping that and keeping those eyes on the future. And I think the turnout today also says that this is a really important conversation to be started. So I'm just really looking forward to absorbing all of the input that we can get today and starting that conversation. So with that, I will hand back to Nick, and thank you very much for coming.
I hope you can hear me, folks. Good. Yeah. Sorry. Sorry about this. Well, thanks very much indeed, Kate. I'm sure you know, we should have a bit of time for questions after Katherine. So if anybody, you'll be happy enough, wouldn't you, if anybody has any questions specifically for you, if you could mark that in chat, and we'll pick it up at that point. So thanks very much. And our next speaker is Cassie Robinson, who's been leading on the civil society approach inquiry, which is absolutely fascinating. So Cassie, if you could give us your insights, we'd very much appreciate that. And as I said before, we'll be using her methodology in terms of the workshops.
Thanks, Nick. And hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I was just going to say, for the sake of some of my colleagues that I think are having to mute people, if you're not on mute, please be on mute if you're not speaking, because that's why we have the echo. But yeah, it's really lovely to be here and to follow on from Kate, who is amazing. And also just want to give a really quick shout out to my team that are here as well, Beth and Sian and Abigail and Sarah, who sort of one foot in this, a few teams, but yeah, they've come to help today, which is great. So I actually was going to just really quickly share some slides, because I'm a very visual person, and I hope that is okay. So you should be able to see them. Kate, can you give me a thumbs up, because I can see you but I can't see hardly anyone else. Great. So yeah, and just to say, like, this is definitely not my methodology and just my work. This is the work of many people in the fund and outside of the fund. But just to sort of put this into the context in which Kate's already talked a bit about, and I'll just build on, I guess, during the pandemic. I mean, well, actually, first of all, I'll just say, as Kate alluded to, you know, this kind of, what timeframes are we working in? Even what, like, worldviews and all of that, there's always going to be tensions in that. And actually at the fund, I think one of the real benefits of the fund is, you know, we are very big, so we can be plural, and that's really important. And, you know, this work really emerged from these two places, recognizing you know, that foresight and longer term thinking and imagination were going to be important at this time, as Kate's already said, but also this idea of emergent strategy. You know, we are hardwired for short-termism, all of us. You know, it's really, really hard to think beyond what we know, what we understand, what we can see, and especially in crisis, you know, when we've got many other things going on. And some of the work we're doing in the UK portfolio, I guess, is focusing more on this kind of insight, foresight, and outsight. Outsight being like, what are the things you wouldn't even possibly imagine or dream of or know about? And foresight, obviously, looking further ahead. And that's important, as Kate said, at this time. But that's sort of where these sort of open inquiries have come from. And also this idea that, you know, we often, because we often think short term, we can often also rethink the same things. We repattern the same things. So we can tend to just optimize things in the existing system and sort of mitigate negative effects and be very reactive and responsive. And I guess some of the work we're also trying to do in the fund, and you're always going to need to do some of that work, especially when you're working on the front line in a crisis. But how can we also support work that's more about transitioning to something new and better? So again, the open inquiries are sort of trying to move more into that sort of system B space. And that was alongside some other funding program that we've done called the Emerging Futures Fund, which also was framed as inquiries through which we hoped communities could lead on kind of anticipating, imagining and shaping their futures. And that content is also feeding into this kind of open inquiry approach. And I guess imagination feels so important here. I'm going to read out this quote because I think it's so good. So, designing policy or strategy without an imaginative sense of where you are going means your best efforts will land you toward the front of the status quo, but not ahead of it. Imagination enlightens strategy, policy and programming and helps you break free of institutional thinking that leads you to piecemeal reform. And again, I think that's a really lovely quote to kind of bring to life what we've been trying to do with the open inquiries. So that was really trying to talk about, you know, thinking differently, thinking beyond the present, not only being reactive and in crisis mode, and trying to build capacity for that. And then the second part was this idea of emergence. And, you know, often I've done it, you know, we do these strategies. We're like, here's our 5-year strategy. We know what we need to do. We're going to have like 5 bullet points. And I think like one of the things we've probably all learned from the pandemic, if we hadn't already sort of known it anyway, is, you know, there's so much uncertainty and there is so much we can't know. So actually having a fixed strategy isn't always authentic to actually the wider context in which we sit. So the whole idea of the open inquiries are actually that they are emergent and we continue them. We'll do that in different ways and in different forms, but they're not a one-off. This is how we hope to continually sense make across the fund with communities to ensure that the things we're doing are relevant and useful and taking on board what communities say they want and need, as well as bringing in some other foresight and other ideas too. And I really like this quote from Anab Jain, you know, that being open to uncertainty, you know, it's a rigor, it's a practice, and it's something that I think a lot of us find very difficult, but actually it's kind of much more fitting for the world that we find ourselves in. I'll be one more minute. So the open inquiries, so far we've done 5. We've had about 900 people come, and some people have loved it and some people have absolutely hated it. And that's just what you're going to get, because, you know, we are living in a plural world. But we did it all online using Miro. And we tried to, design and invite a space where people felt that they could just come and be and spend time. And, you know, we had some really amazing engagement. We're still writing those up. And obviously the things that you do today, we hope will feed into this. And then what comes from this, you know, hopefully it will, more than anything, be useful for you as a group, as a community, as a network, in helping to shape and inform your own thinking and how you can work together. But it hopefully will also feed into some of the stuff the fund might be thinking about, and other organizations and institutions we might have present today. So I've probably gone over time. I said I was going to be really quick, but yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for coming, because I think it's great, the level of engagement.
Thank you so much for that, Cassie. That phrase, "not retreating from the ache," will live with me for a long time. It was really, really fascinating. And if you didn't go over time, we're actually currently 2 minutes under time. So I'd like to thank Kate and Cassie for managing to deliver on that for us. And again, Cassie, presumably you're more than happy to answer questions in our slot after Catherine's spoken as well. So thank you very much indeed. So to our keynote, Katherine Trebeck, from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. You founded it, I think, Katherine. Did you not?
I was one of many people. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have a full half hour. So looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And I'm going to try and very quickly, I hope, bring up my slides. Can someone just give me a thumbs up if you can see them? Right, great. I'm so delighted to be at this conversation. I'm zooming into you from the most glorious morning in Glasgow, and it's just nice to think that the skies is probably so clear that if I stood on my roof, I could probably wave to you at the moment. But really looking forward to the breakout sessions too, and the discussion. And I want to pick up one of Kate's challenges about just really how hard it is to lift our heads and look at some of the wider structural context of this work that when we're constantly trying to keep going today and tomorrow and the next week, and just help people manage with those immediate contexts. I'm going to step very much into that macro space, and I want to talk to you about really this idea of what a different economic system to the one that we had going into coronavirus could look like, because for so many reasons, the one that we had was failing on many fronts that I'll talk through. But in a macro sense, this economy that we've got, one that's designed for and dependent on economic growth, I think we could all point to some of the benefits of that growth, things, and you'll probably all have your favorite ones, but things like globally, mothers and babies surviving childbirth, certain diseases being eradicated by, though of course we're seeing new ones emerge, rising life expectancy in many parts of the world, literacy rates falling, and so on. And you all probably point to your favorite example of progress. The key thing is, though, that so much of that progress has been achieved not by growth for its own sake, but when growth has been concertedly and proactively used to invest in our collective institutions, our health systems, our public education systems, and so on. And I want to share with you this quote from the UN in their second to last Human Development Report. And they say, look, we should celebrate this remarkable progress that over the last few decades has supported many people reach minimum standards of human development. But then they warn that we shouldn't continue those policies that led to those success. And that's sort of UN speak for what our Icelandic friends, just after they were hit so badly by the global financial crisis, they were talking about how what they'd suffered in Iceland was success-induced bias, in the sense that they had just assumed that those recipes that apparently had done their job to some degree, and we can debate that, in the past were automatically the ones that would be fit for purpose for the future. And so where we're standing now, when we've seen so patiently how those recipes have failed on so many different fronts, why is it time for a new recipe? Well, partly because the fruits of growth have been so profoundly unevenly shared. This is, as you see here, the world's most expensive cocktail. I'm ashamed to admit it's from a bar in Melbourne. It's called the Winston Churchill. It costs over $12,000. But it's an example to me of just how the extent to some people have been enabled to amass extraordinary amounts of wealth and resources. And of course, their environmental impacts are profoundly correlated to that, while so many people haven't. We've seen, for example, if normal wages were rising at the same amount of those of directors, the national minimum wage would be £19 now. We've seen huge increases on capital as opposed to wages. And we've seen massive amount of wealth accumulate at the top. And for the rest of us, income's largely flatlining. The McKinsey consultancy company recently reported that 70% of the UK population had their incomes flatlining over the last decade, similar or higher levels in places like Italy, in the US, in France. And then just in this last year, what we've had is lockdown, which has just exacerbated these pre-existing inequalities, where those of us who are lucky enough to have jobs that we can do from our kitchen tables, that we can do on Zoom calls like this, have been fairly economically sheltered from the impact of the coronavirus crisis, where those folks who are on just-in-time contracts, treated the same way as just-in-time inventory, are exposed to the precariousness of that gig economy market, literally on demand at the gig of an app, more exposed to the health impacts, going into debt if they're, and lucky if they're keeping their jobs. These are the youngest people, there's huge ethnic minority parallel and gradient in this, particularly single women as well. So we're just seeing those inequalities that we had at the beginning of coronavirus getting worse and worse by what's come since. But on top of those injustices that of course have race and gender dimensions, we've seen that the economic growth model that we've had over the last few decades has been pushing our planet to the brink. And this is a picture from the wildfires that just about 14 months ago were burning up the southeast corner of the country I grew up in. But it's almost every day we're seeing more examples of what happens when we push Mother Nature beyond what she can handle. And it's also an economic system that is hurting so many people. And again, even prior to COVID, we saw rising levels of in-work poverty, rising levels of food bank use, rising levels of loneliness, self-harm, sense of alienation. So for all these reasons, it wasn't cutting the mustard, that economic model that we had pre-coronavirus crisis. And I want to just quickly chart a couple of dimensions that help me at least get my head around some of those dynamics of our economic system. One is this idea of diminishing marginal returns. So any of you who are economists will be familiar with this idea. Essentially, you get less bang for your buck the more you have of something. And it reminds me of salt, actually. We all need a little bit of salt in our diets, but very quickly, more and more starts to become harmful and damaging. I'm going to give you one example of how that plays out in the macroeconomy in terms of more and more growth. This is charting on the y-axis life expectancy years, and along the x-axis you can see GDP per capita is mapped. And you can see that in early stages of economic development, more GDP really does matter in terms of increases in life expectancy, but then it starts to tail off. We could replace on that y-axis life satisfaction, various dimensions of social progress, and you would see a similar sort of diminishing marginal returns. Some scholars, though, would say, hang on a minute, diminishing marginal returns is a fairly benign way of looking at things. And actually, what's happening is we're entering this stage of uneconomic growth in countries like the UK, the US, Australia, and so on, where what we're doing is spending a lot of the financial bounty of growth on spending on making up for the damage that growth model has done. And you can see that in the massive amounts of money that go on topping up people's wages because their salaries and their wages are not paying them enough to put food on the table, on housing benefit, on spending on remedial education because of the impacts of poverty and inequality, on the prescription drugs and non-prescription drugs because people are stressed and alienated and anxious about their futures and don't feel their lives are in control. And this picture here in terms of the level that we spend on security, and just because we're essentially scared of each other. It's been estimated that in the US, over 5 million people at least work in what's been defined as guard labor, essentially because we've not got societies where we trust each other and feel safe around each other. And I was looking for a way to describe this rather punchily, and this is back before coronavirus, and I was walking down the street in Glasgow and I saw these two banners outside a gym, and to me it just encapsulated this almost the inefficient nature of this situation, that we're doing something that is causing great damage that we then have to spend money to heal and repair and fix. And it's a profoundly inefficient way of setting up our economy. It's avoidable if we had been smarter in the first place. And of course, in environmental terms, ecological economists would talk about defensive expenditure. So the other element I just want to share with you is this idea of pseudo-satisfiers. This comes from one of my favorite economists, Manfred Max Neef, who passed away a couple of years ago. He says, we've got fundamental human needs that we all share in common. These are what makes us innately human, and we satisfy them in different ways. So often you see this idea of pseudo-satisfiers, though, where he warns that what we're doing is reaching for something that won't really satisfy our true human needs. And the one example he gives is of shopping and consumption to replace our fundamental human need for social affiliation and connection. But so it is with GDP growth. Our real needs for dignity, decent livelihood, decent local environment, we're reaching for more and more GDP growth, and it's not delivering what we need. And again, an example of a pseudo-satisfier to me was really apparent with this project, which is an example of humanitarian intervention, but it's essentially trying to meet folks' fundamental human needs for shelter and for safety by offering them stab-proof sleeping bags, which I think is just a profoundly sad example of how low our expectations are, that we're just helping people cope. And so to sum that up, we're essentially got this, what I describe as the long way around to good lives, the long road, which is essentially get the economy to go bigger, but don't fret too much about the damage that does to people and planet, and then try to sequester some of that back through the tax system, and then use that to channel that money to helping people and planet cope with the economic system that we had. And the thing is, people are recognizing that we can do better than that. I'm really sorry there's not some Northern Irish stats on this, but this is just one of many opinion polls that have come out last year and the preceding decades, where there's mountains of evidence, whether it's deliberative democracy, participation, or surveys such as this one, where people are starting to recognize that we need to prioritize the health and well-being of people rather than faster economic growth and that treadmill of failure, demand and spending on what we could have avoided. I want to pause for a moment and think about the idea of well-being. It's a term that's certainly gained a lot of currency in the last few years and decades, but it's used almost ubiquitously. And I want to just share with you how I understand it. For me, there are two different ways of thinking about well-being. One is what I describe as this 1SC of the survival and coping. And this often is very individualized approach to well-being. Often the prescriptions are very individualized as well, helping people through treatment or individually orientated interventions. And that is absolutely vital because it's helping people survive and cope with today and tomorrow and next week. That's a humanitarian response to an inhumane economic system. But the other SC is system change. And that's where the wellbeing economy agenda is firmly situated, saying that it is not enough just to help people survive and cope, that we need to, as Kate was saying, raise our heads to look up at the wider structural conversations, what's going on in our macroeconomy that's pushing people to need to survive and cope in the first place. Why can't we think more boldly, think about flourishing rather than just survival and coping? And hence, the idea of a wellbeing economy is at its most simplest about social justice on a healthy planet. How can we have the economy geared up in service of that goals? And if we think about what a wellbeing economy needs to have at its heart, you can get a sense of that, whether you're reading development scholarship or looking at neuroscience and brain scans of what makes people happy and relaxed, or where the cortisol of stress is racing through their veins. Deliberative democracy conversations will tell you. But instead of charting through that, I want to share with you, I think, these very powerful reflections of Bronnie Ware, who was a palliative care nurse, and she worked for decades with patients and literally holding their hand in their last days. And she collated some of the regrets that they shared with her in the last few hours of their time on this earth. And she says there are things like that people wish they'd had courage to live a life true to themselves, wish they hadn't worked so hard, wish I'd had the courage to express my feelings, wish I'd stayed in touch with my friends, and I wish I'd let myself be happier. And you pull that together and you get very powerful messages of authenticity, of work-life balance and relationships. And so when we turn to the economy and think about what is it that the economy needs to deliver, at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we worked with our membership to really distill all their different visions for a different economic system and boil them down into what we describe as the 5 we all needs. And I suspect these will be quite intuitive to you in all the work that you're doing. You probably embody this in many, many ways. But things like fairness, justice in all its dimensions, restoring and regenerating the natural world, about participation, making sure people are engaged in the decisions that affect them, locally rooted communities. It's about connecting with each other and about dignity and ensuring that everyone has enough to live on. So how do we transform the economy so that it's in service of those needs rather than in service of some false holy grail of faster GDP growth? Well, it's a hell of a complex picture. I often think of it as this 10,000 piece jigsaw puzzle that we all need to bring what we can bring to this conversation. And community wealth building, bottom-up economies, community empowerment is a key piece of that jigsaw puzzle, but it's multifaceted. It has to happen at all different levels of the system. Our infrastructure, our tax systems, all sorts of things need to be in place. There is no one silver bullet here. It's not as easy as flicking a light switch. This is a complex, challenging process of economic system change. But essentially, it's all in service of designing the economy in a way so that it does more of the heavy lifting and delivering what people really, really need. And so some of the core examples, I'd say some of the perhaps non-negotiable pillars of a wellbeing economy are things like pre-distribution, which is a hell of an ugly term, but to me it's a really exciting idea where we design markets in a way to distribute wealth and resources more equally, so we don't then have to turn to the state at 5 o'clock o'clock in the afternoon and say, help us redistribute and marginally rebalance those unequal outcomes that the market itself created. It's about community wealth building. I know we're going to be talking about through a lot of the breakout sessions. It's about designing businesses so that profit is a vehicle rather than a destination and a goal in and of itself. It's about accounting for environmental and social impact, and it's about participatory democracy, ensuring that people have a say and can engage with each other, and so on and so on and so on. And I suspect all of you will have policies and ideas and changes and levers that you would add to that list, because there's many that we need to change. But I want to reflect, well, what does this mean for government? Well, at one high level, government needs to shift its orientation to being fair weather friends of growth rather than its ever faithful followers, as we've had to date. And essentially that means disentangling the difference between means and ends, understanding that growth needs to be in service of those higher order goals, those needs that I've talked about, rather than the goal in itself, and shifting gear to paying much more attention to the direction and the composition of growth, rather than just focusing on what's the rate of growth, what's the rate of GDP change in the last quarter, for example. And essentially what I mean by that, this is about nurturing what matters most to our communities and to our planet. This is growing what we need more of in a wellbeing economy, and deliberately and gently and constructively powering down those sorts of growth areas and those sorts of businesses, those sorts of activities that are not aligned with a wellbeing economy. So that's for government. In terms of businesses and enterprises, we took those 5 real needs that I shared with you earlier, and we've applied them to, well, what does that mean for a business or an enterprise that's trying to think about how they can be a proactive contribution to a different economic system? And I'll talk you through them very briefly. Well, in terms of connection, this is about thinking about the corporate culture. How does it align with collective values? This is thinking about dignity. How can we design the business model so that it creates the means for all sorts of stakeholders to live dignified lives? When we're talking about fairness, again, this comes back to the very nature of the business model. Is it one that distributes wealth, or is it extractive and funneling it up to remote shareholders? When we're thinking about nature, this is production and consumption systems. Do they do so in a way that regenerates rather than adds to the problems on our environment? And finally, in terms of participation for enterprises, it's got to be about thinking about what sort of relationships are balanced. How do we include all stakeholders? Who is around the table when enterprise decisions get made? And in terms of individuals, partly it's recognizing that for some of us, we have enough, we have plenty. And it's also about recognizing that personal success is not about aligned with how much stuff we have, and reconsidering our personal success and thinking about more aligned to those fundamental human needs of dignity and contribution and connection with our communities. And I want to share with you this beautiful quote I read a couple of years ago that to me sums up those shifting ideas of success away from perpetual consumption and hoarding. This idea that if you're lucky enough to drink wine by the sea, you are lucky enough because you've got enough in place. You've got enough to survive. Don't have to work 3 jobs and every waking hour to put food on the table. So you can take that breath. So that in a way to me is a really nice little metric or symbolic threshold of when people have enough to take their time out. And for communities, it means moving away from the old system where communities were extracted from, hardly ever asked, so often left on their own, under-resourced, and completely exhausted. And the change, the new way, what does a wellbeing economy mean for communities? Well, it's about community up. So this is this idea of community wealth building, having the economy be created and vibrant community first, rather than keeping our fingers crossed and waiting for trickle down. It's about communities being in control of the agendas that impact them, rather than just being asked to consult on the margins, on the detail, rather than the agenda in and of itself. It's about communities being underwritten so that they can experiment and be brave and take things in the direction that they want to, but knowing that they'll be underwritten by government or other agencies. Communities invested in bringing in the sort of investment that's required on their terms. and communities that are feeling energized and excited and hopeful about the future. And there are plenty of good examples of where a wellbeing economy is already emerging, where things are being put in place to start to reconstruct the economic system in a way that meets the needs of people and planet. And these, I think, are really important to recognize because they give us hope that change is possible. They remind us that this different way of doing things is not just desirable, but it's also profoundly feasible if we could just rearrange things and go larger on some of these changes that we required. And so in terms of governments starting to recognize that they need to pursue a broader understanding of progress rather than just the rate of GDP per capita, here in Scotland, we've had for many years now something called the National Performance Framework, where at its heart, it's got well-being, values, kindness, dignity, and compassion about the centre of what the economy and what the government and what Scotland wants to be. And of course, Scotland's not on its own. That's mirrored and learns from the OECD's wellbeing framework. This is New Zealand's wellbeing framework that underpins you've probably heard of their wellbeing budget from a couple of years ago. This is what our colleagues in Wales have been doing. They've got these brilliant 7 dimensions underpinned by a commissioner for the wellbeing of current and future generations who will hold government to account for their decisions along the lines of implementing these goals. And I love this from Bhutan as well. They've, of course, got their 9 dimensions of gross national happiness. And it's not happiness in the individual sense on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you? This is about collective, multi-dimensional well-being. And they have a policy screening tool that they won't pass policies if it is not seen to be in service of gross national happiness. And what's really interesting is that, of course, having all those nice frameworks is one thing. It's really hard to put this in place. This is the crunchy stage. Having visions is the straightforward bit. Putting it in place in terms of economic policy making is challenging. And so Scotland, with New Zealand, with Iceland, with Wales, and just recently Finland, have created something called the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. And this is all about governments and civil servants recognizing that in the 21st century, success cannot just be about faster GDP growth. It has to be about the collective well-being of people and planet. But they also united by the sense that none of them have all the answers. And so they gather in policy labs to learn from each other and to share their experiences and to collaborate and go on the journey of continuous improvement. And in terms of business, there are so many examples of what businesses are doing to try to be part of the positive solution. When we saw that, even in the coronavirus crisis, we saw a lot of businesses put aside the short-term profit imperative to be part of the collective solution. And then we've got those businesses who in their very DNA are using profit as a means to wider social and environmental returns, whether it's social enterprises like the Remade Network who repair and fix things so we don't have to throw them out, whether it's one of my favorite organizations, this is a worker cooperative, Green City Whole Foods, just down the road from me here in Glasgow, that since the 70s has been owned. Can you still see me as my slides come up? Oh, that's Google playing up on me. So Green City Whole Foods is a worker co-op that since the 70s has been about delivering benefits for their workers rather than extracting profit elsewhere. You've got banks like Triodos Bank, a benefit corporation, comes from the Netherlands, working here too now, where they're saying our job is not to make loads of money for shareholders, but to channel finance and investment into the sort of activities that are needed in a new economic system. And then you've got lovely businesses being really practical in terms of regenerating nature. This is one of my favorites. This is an organization that uses discarded coffee granules to make face cream and face balms, and it's absolutely beautiful. There are hundreds of these out there, and you'll all probably know some of them. I hope you support them. But these are the sort of businesses that prove it is possible to design businesses in a different way. And in terms of what's going on in communities, I want to share with you very briefly an amazing story of an organisation just based outside Glasgow here called Linwood, and the Linwood Community Development Trust. They've been going for a while, and essentially they resisted a top-down, corporate-orientated, extractive economic model that was being imposed on them. And this bunch of local women, extraordinary local women, just said, no, we're not having that. What we want to do is design an economy that is for the community and by the community. And they did loads and loads and loads of consultation. They're building a massive football pitch for the community. They're building cafes. They've got loads of different businesses. They are essentially building a wellbeing economy in Linwood. They have fought their battles, they've shed their tears, but they are showing us in microcosm that it is possible to have a wellbeing economy that's led by the community and for the community. They won't use the sort of geeky policy language that I use, but they're rolling up their sleeves and delivering it. And I want to share with you Kirsty Flanagan, who's one of the main protagonists behind the Linwood Community Development Trust, how she describes what does a wellbeing economy mean for us. And she says it's about when assets are in service of communities. It's when there's a single mum who's asked for support so that she can then support local people struggling with addictions and mental health issues. Kirsty says a wellbeing economy is about equality, it's about respect, it's about empowerment, it's about ownership, and it's about trust. And her final line there in blue, where she says it's not about having to constantly ask for permission to change what needs to change. And to me, I think that just sums up beautifully the role of communities building a wellbeing economy from them first, from community upward. And so what will this take? This is an extraordinary challenge. There's heaps of changes we need, and we need everyone's hand to the tiller. We need all the shoulders turning attention to this massive change that we can get. But a couple of things, and this builds on Cassie's point. In part, it is about imagination. And so I'm reminded that Ronald Reagan, back in 1983, he said to us, there are no limits to growth because there are no limits to imagination and human intelligence and wonder. And I think now, in a way, one of the biggest risks to building a wellbeing economy is actually our limited collective imaginations that stop us thinking that we could have an economy that is better than growth. And so to get there, we need to smash open our imaginations and allow ourselves to learn from the Linwoods, from Green City Whole Foods, from those organizations using coffee granules as face serums, from the Triodos banks, from those pioneering governments, and know that a wellbeing economy is not just desirable, but it's absolutely possible. And it will be possible if we support those pioneers and we learn from them and we replicate their work, and we also take the lessons of their work to transform what policymakers are doing so that the policy regime is in service of that sort of activity rather than this amazing pioneering work already happening, but so often against the grain and facing massive headwinds from the wider policy regime. And finally, we will only get there if we collaborate like we have never collaborated before. Because when humans come together, they can do extraordinary things. But we won't get there if we just focus in our own little silos, on our own pet projects, in our own little communities. We'll only do this if we recognize that we're part of a greater whole and support each other and have each other's backs and share with each other. And perhaps most importantly, as Cassie was saying, this is exhausting work. If we encourage each other and celebrate the successes and keep each other going and look after each other, because it is hard, hard work. I want to leave you with this quote that says, a revolutionary moment in the world's history is a time for revolution, not for patching. And no one could be in any disagreement that we're certainly in a revolutionary moment in this world's history. But if we just go back to those old recipes and patch and repair and fix up and just only focus on helping people survive and cope with today's economic system, we won't create the sort of economic system change that we could if we work together. And these words were written in the midst of the Second World War by William Beveridge on the document that formed the foundation of our national welfare state and our NHS. And so if he can imagine that back then, surely we can imagine that, something better for our future. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Catherine. If anybody wasn't inspired by that, they can't possibly even be awake. That was an amazing talk. I think we all got so much out of it. I'm personally was really, really moved as well by the palliative care nurse that you mentioned in the piece, because I think that, again, I suppose a lot of us have found through bereavement in our families or bad things that have happened, not just during pandemic, but at other times, what really matters. And it seems so sad that people wake up to that either too late. It was wonderful. I mean, personally, before I get into questions, I'd be really interested in, you know, as this debate unfolds, in sort of how we move a bit more from the inspiring vision to activism, because it does strike me that whatever, you know, I couldn't personally find anything that I would want to disagree with you about, but where I'd be very frustrated is that is how you move government here. You'll have had experience in Scotland. The UK government doesn't seem to be particularly amenable to this. Political parties by their nature tend to be command and control and don't like to diffuse power. So you are talking about effectively a kind of, not even a quiet revolution, and how that can be affected. I hope will sort of fit into the workshops that Cass has inspired and lead to a lot of debate. But rather than me just talking, we have questioners lined up. Any more, please do feed in through the chat.
Can I come in on your point around how we change government, just briefly though? Just to flag everyone, there's a petition at the moment to the UK government, and it's started by a young woman in Brighton who has put a petition to UK government, and where essentially if we get over 10,000 signatures, it'll have to be responded to. If we can get over 1,000, it's essentially saying we want the UK government in the lead up to COP to turn its attention to creating a wellbeing economy. And I think in a way it so epitomizes what wellbeing economy is about, because we didn't start it. This is this young woman in Brighton who just recognized the challenges facing the world, and she's just rolled up her sleeves and created that. And it's supported by Caroline Lucas and Clive Lewis and other members of parliament. So please do sign that. And I'm hoping I'm not quick enough, but if someone can find the petition, actually there's a link on our website. So it's weall.org/petition. So if someone's able to put that in the chat, that would be amazing. So please do sign that and promote that. It'd be wonderful to support this young woman who's just, to me, embodying that sense of we have to make this happen ourselves. That's at the heart of the wellbeing economy agenda. Sorry, Nick, to interrupt you.
Oh no, and I'm sure it'll appear in the chat shortly.
Thanks, Michelle.
I'm sure everybody who's been involved in this is probably enjoying the chat every bit as much as the speaker. It's a very lively debate going on in parallel. But anyway, enough of me. Our first question is from Nigel McKinney.
Hello, Nick. Catherine, that was a very inspiring presentation. And I suppose originally I was going to ask a question about technology, but I've slightly changed. And the question is, what do we need to do to change the system so that those good examples of what is radical action become the norm and not the exception? So it's really about, on the one hand, we need more activism and we need more support, flexible, suitable support for community activism. But community activists on their own won't change the wider governance structures or policy environment. And what do we need to do to get radical change there?
Fantastic. Nigel, too, if you've got ideas, do share them as well. So I'll start, and maybe you can come up with things that you're seeing that are useful and effective. I mean, I think activism is exhausting, isn't it? Before I moved to Scotland 15 or so years ago, I did a lot of work working with Aboriginal communities and their engagement with big mining companies around their local communities and how they were trying to shape the activities and the behaviour of those big mining companies. And these were communities whose life expectancy was 20 or so years below that of the average Australians. English probably their second or third language. And I remember speaking to this extraordinary traditional owner who was fighting off the idea to build a uranium mine on a sacred site in a World Heritage listed national park. And this old guy, he said, you know, I'm tired. I'm not fighting anymore. And I think there's something in that around how activism in itself is about, the very best of citizenship. And so how do we support people keeping on going with holding our governments to account? How do we support people who are brave enough to call out abuses of power when they see them? How do we support people like those amazing women in Linwood? And they would at some point invite them to chat to you, but they will tell you of how they went to meetings where they were met by this phalanx of men in dark suits who had their marketing degrees and their business degrees and their lawyer degrees, and how they reduced these women to tears, essentially intimidating, saying that their ideas of these women for their local community were not good enough and that they should be just dismissed. And so it is extraordinarily hard work. And I think this is partly why the Wellbeing Economy Alliance was created, and Peter and Sean and others who are here are going to be able to share a bit more about the idea for Wellbeing Economy Alliance Hub in Ireland. But it's essentially about taking care of each other and being movement generous and creating the spaces where people can feel connected and be also reminded and reassured that they're not alone. Because this can be really, really lonely work, whether you're a scholar in a university who's building the evidence base around this, where all your academic colleagues think very differently, or you're an entrepreneur within a major institution, like a lot of the policymakers that I work with know that things need to change, whether you're in a funding organization that's trying to go beyond those metrics of X number of beneficiaries in Q1 to actually how do you map and measure contribution to system change, and whether you're those community activists, all of those people need support. And that's partly what We All was created. But Nigel, that's my thought. If you've got anything, pile in on what you've got. So you got a question there?
Apologies, Catherine. Yeah, I just wanted to, if I may, Nigel, with your forgiveness, just if we could bring Cassie into this for a second, because whilst you were talking there, and Nigel's question made a really interesting insight about the role of imagination and creativity in this process. Cassie, if you're still there, could you elaborate? Look, I could see. Yeah, can you elaborate on that a little for us?
I mean, I feel like I'm just going to repeat what I've already said, so I won't say too much. I mean, yeah, I feel like activism is exhausting, as Catherine's just said, and it's also really important. But I think the role of creation is particularly important right now, and imagination and invention is part of that. But I've also just shared in the chat an image which is called The Layers, which sounds very mysterious. But that's also, I think, links to the question too about how do we influence change. It's actually an image that is building on the model someone called Giles, who's an academic in the north of England. Catherine's nodding her head, and we've added a fourth layer, which is the sort of soil. I don't know, can people open that all right? But basically the sort of general gist of the image, and I hope people can download it and open it, is you know, it just makes that point, which I'm sure many people already know, but the need to work at multiple levels, and like you need to do the work in the soil of like the culture making, the healing, but you also need to think about the policy changes and the rules and the regulations, and you also need the innovations and the community layer of kind of experiments. And I guess, you know, as many people have sort of said in the chat, that's why collaboration is so important, and really working as an ecosystem, like understanding the different roles to take. Some people are much more suited to doing the policy influencing. Some people are much more suited to doing the institutional changes. Some people are much more suited to being the glue that kind of, you know, holds those ecosystems together. And I think that it's those layers for me is how I'm currently trying to sort of think about how we influence this kind of quite transformative and deep change.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed, Cassie. More questions, if you don't mind, Nigel, because there's quite a queue here. I'm going to turn to Mary McManus, please, first.
Catherine, thanks very much for your presentation. It's really nice to have heard it and to have an audience here listen to you. I was wondering about, I suppose again, I do think the best approach is for us to try to build something from the ground up if the policymakers or the government won't listen. I suppose yesterday I was very struck by the fact I heard a presentation from the Royal College of Paediatricians on poverty in Northern Ireland, and they came to all our attention, a woman called Julianne Meany, when she spoke some months ago about what she was seeing in children's A&E. And I suppose it's, for me, I work in my career has been in an advice centre, and it's been looking at how people have been impacted by poverty and welfare reform. And then often when I'm at policy stuff, I come up against academic argument, do you know? Like last night, and Kate's here, Kate Clifford from the Alliance Party, I was at an event when there were politicians at it, and it's just this gap between, you know, when you see on the ground how people are impacted, and, you know, listening to that paediatrician who works in children's A&E and her anguish, and then to come up against with just the, you know, to bring about change, how do we deal with the academic and, okay, how, you know, just this difference between the urgency of what needs to happen on the ground and then how it's treated in an academic way? You know, how do we bridge that gap?
I think, Mary, I mean, it's really, really good question. And I think there's something around how knowledge and evidence is defined and created. And so often that evidence of people in communities themselves and folks, you know, like you're working in advice centres. To me, you're an expert on some of those trends. You will know probably more than the academics were able to come up with the figures of trends in people's needs. So there's a community group that I used to work with over a couple of decades ago out in Clydebank, which is, you know, on the west of Glasgow. And before the global financial crisis hit, so before GDP figures were tracking down, they were an independent advice centre, Clydebank Independent Advice Centre, Independent Resource Centre, and they said they were already seeing parents and grandparents remortgaging their houses in order to be able to provide some financial collateral to their children in their 20s and 30s, because the financial insecurity, the financial footing on which those families were living was already starting to shake. And so in a way, they were the early warning signs of what was about to come in the macroeconomy. If we had credited that as tangible evidence the way we should, we would have known much earlier, and we could have put in place some better systems to deal with what was coming. And so I do think there is a question around what counts as evidence and whose expertise and who gets the validation of being seen as an expert. And I think where that's going in a really nice direction is in some of the deliberative democracy conversations, where you have sort of academic experts who are very specialized, who are on tap to the participants themselves, but they're not the ones driving the agendas. And I think that's really important. I think there's also something around not just crediting that deep specialist knowledge as the only knowledge that's worthy of our respect and admiration. And if you look at, say, someone who I'm quite inspired by, you know, Donella Meadows, one of the great thinkers on system thinkers, she said, you know, people who change the world will not be those deep subject area specialists. They are people who can dance with the system, who can reach across different academic silos, different subject areas. People in government who bring this about won't be the government officials who just narrowly focus on their day job. The people who bring about wellbeing economy in government will be those who can reach out to other agencies. And so, for example, someone in the health service or the education department who recognises if they do their job well, the police department will benefit, and how maybe they can find a way to pool their budgets and do what's called diagonal budgeting. So it demands of us quite a profoundly different way of thinking about evidence and expertise and collaboration. And I certainly don't have all the answers, but I see little tiny examples of where it works well. And one of the really nice aspects of the New Zealand wellbeing budget is that government departments were really forced to work together. They were basically told if they didn't come with a spending proposal that involved more than 2 government departments, they'd be sent on their bike, go away and think again. And so it's starting now, you know, it was a mandate, and it's starting now a few years on to become a more natural way of working. They're the sorts of things we need more of.
Thank you. That actually sounds your last point, because I think every word suffers from silo working, but we really do. And I actually think that would be quite a good recommendation for the anti-poverty strategy to enable that for here. So
thank you for that. And sorry to butt in, but we've still got quite a few questions that I'd be keen to get to before we break out at 12. My next one is from John Barry.
Thank you, Nigel, and hi, Catherine, and like many other people, thoroughly enjoyed and feel inspired by your presentation. My question is a difficult one. I'd imagine most of us on the call are probably in the same kind of space and wanting maybe revolutionary or certainly transformative action. But what strategies can you recommend from your experience about engaging with those either in government, the statutory sector, the voluntary sector, or our communities who aren't on the same page as us? So what are the frames, the languages that perhaps we can use to open up conversations with people who may not share where we're at?
So it's a really, really good question. And I suspect folks here will have their own examples of what's been effective or what they've tried and hasn't worked. And we can probably learn just as much from that. I'm really pragmatic in terms of meeting people where they are and understanding what arguments or different explanations will appeal to them. And to be honest, John, I used to feel a little bit squeamish thinking, oh, Katherine, you're being a bit of a sellout there. You're not going with a pure message each and every time. And I heard from someone just a few weeks ago, a psychologist, reminding us that as humans, we've got about 20 different stories that we use when we meet someone new to explain ourselves. So for example, you know, if I met you, John, and we were chatting at a barbecue, it's probably a different way of saying, I'm Catherine, I'm doing this, as opposed to if we met on an official Monday morning meeting, I'd tell you more about my work. Just because I tell you a different aspect to myself doesn't make that inauthentic or less valid. So I use that to remind myself to say it's okay to be pragmatic and to explain to different audiences what you think will have most traction there. And so this is a long way of, and sorry, Nick, long answer. This is a long way of coming to one of the works we're doing, jobs we're doing at the moment, a project at We All, is trying to count up some of that avoidable demand, that failure demand, that defensive expenditure that I talked about earlier, because those bean counters in governments who might not be convinced by what I'd say are sort of, you know, the moral arguments of this, they massively will be convinced by the efficiency arguments. If you can say we are spending so much, that's essentially inefficient, wasteful, and avoidable. And it's a demand on the state that if we were smarter in creating an economy that met people's needs and protected the planet, we wouldn't need to spend. So we're trying to take a look at the Scottish government's budget and also a province in Canada to tally up. And it's going to be an art, not a science, because where do you draw the line on some of these? There's some areas that are really obvious, and then some, well, how do you split? So to give you a really simple example of that, from my window here, I can see the massive hospital, the Queen Margaret Hospital in Glasgow. And one of our board members of We All Scotland, brilliant guy called Tam, he said, and he always has this knack of summing things up really powerfully. He says, you know, see that hospital there? That's 8 stories high. Maybe in a wellbeing economy, it would be 3 stories high. Because, yeah, people would still break their legs. People would probably still get cancer, but maybe we wouldn't have so much stress and alienation that's leading people to overdose or to, you know, become dependent on prescription drugs that then needs that expensive medical treatment. And so the work of, you know, pulling out, and I hate doing this because it's almost saying this is the business case for a wellbeing economy. But to go back to the, you know, the pragmatist in me, that will really connect with some audiences. And then other audiences, meet them where they're human. And there's a lot of really beautiful work in the migrant and refugee support community around how to engage people on a human level through storytelling. The other aspect, and Donella Meadows reminds us of this too, is don't waste your time with reactionaries. We won't convince everyone, and that will just, trying to do that will just feel like you're smashing your head on a brick wall, and it will lead to more exhaustion. So go with the people who are potentially warm and open to these conversations. Allow yourself to have some of the time with people who completely get it, because that will refuel your tanks and help you go out more powerfully. But we don't need to convince anyone too. I mean, you'll know this more than me. There's a lot of social scientists who are saying for a tipping point to be reached, we need between 10 to 15% of the population. And if those opinion polls I showed you just one of are anything to go by, then we're massively there. We just need to sort of put these things into practice.
Thanks, Catherine. The reason I was grimacing earlier on, by the way, Catherine, if you were looking at the by any chance, was just that Charlie and I were debating off stage whether we should actually extend this discussion by five minutes or so. If anybody has any views about that, please let us know. We're still very keen not to impinge on the workshops, but we seem to have, everybody seems to be getting a lot out of this. John, I think John's point's really worth really drilling into in the future as well. And maybe you know that sometimes we could learn from the past what happened. You know, the 1880s in Ireland, we had a revolutionary economic movement based around creameries and credit unions, which was founded by a guy called Horace Plunkett, who's a forgotten revolutionary in Irish politics. The creameries went well, the credit unions failed. And that was because there was a dependence on the British administration at Dublin Castle who pulled the plug in the 1910s. So, you know, I suppose the thing is that we're on ground that's been trodden before. So where can we learn lessons from it as well? So it's just an observation from me. I shouldn't be doing this. I should just be chairing the debate, which brings me actually very neatly to Kate Clifford. Kate's still there?
Yeah, sorry, thank you. Just first of all, I want to say just what a fantastic and inspirational presentation. It's great to have hope again in a sector that is exhausted and burnt out. And I do think people are exhausted and burnt out from the last number of years, not just COVID. I think COVID was the straw that broke the camel's back. I suppose my challenge in all of this is that as a sector, we're used to collaboration. Northern Ireland has a particular community and voluntary sector that is steeped in what I would describe as 11+ scenarios. So the 11+ is where we threw our arms around our homework and competed with everybody else in order to get on. And community groups have been encouraged through funding strategies in the last number of years to throw their arm around their homework and survive. And it's been survival of the fittest, not always survival of the best. How do we now as a sector reach out and encourage collaboration, despite the fact that community funders and those who hold the purse strings will always encourage us to be in competition with the other? Because the first principle for me in community development is about looking about to see who's not thriving, to see who's not at our table. And I suppose the challenge for me in all of this is that if we have winners and losers in community development funding, how do we ensure that we as a sector don't perpetuate that, but we actually reach out to those who are struggling and pull them out and pull them up alongside us? So it's a huge challenge, I think.
If I can just jump in there, Kate. Catherine, we have after Kate, we've got two more questions. So you've got two options really. Either you can speak a bit faster, or you can say a bit less. Apologies for being rude, but I'm just keen to see if we can get things on time, and hope that isn't annoying for you either, Kate.
Would Kate and Cassie like to reflect on Kate Clifford's question there? I think is from the perspective of how funders can go beyond that implicit, probably unintentional encouragement of competition between.
Yeah, I'm very happy to. I think it's something that we've thought a huge amount about over the last couple of years, particularly because, and I mentioned that sort of the discussion and the engagements that we had around this, the consultation on sort of dormant accounts and resilience and so on, and the really clear message we got was, well, here's what we can do. Individual organisations, here's what we need, and here's how we experience this. But here are the systemic issues which fundamentally are one of the biggest barriers to and create that competitive environment, and that those come from a funding environment that is incredibly disjointed, and we couldn't sort of treat some of those issues on an individual level without sort of looking at that wider funding ecology. So I think others have reflected on the fact that lots of issues have been put into much sharper focus over the last year, and I think this is one of them: the urgent need for collaboration between funders and an understanding of that impact, actually. And it's one of the things that we've heard, and we've tried to, and we are talking actively to the Northern Ireland Executive about, in different departments, about actually, you know, we've been talking about reducing bureaucracy and working more closely together for years. And I think everybody in this room would nod and say, dear goodness, we've heard that a lot. But, you know, the urgency of it, and the urgency is that, you know, we all have a responsibility, you know, to try and push that kind of really constructive collaboration, the sharing of information, you know, the data, the insights that we get, to share those as widely as possible, to reduce that kind of, you know, to make sure that when we're thinking about our funding strategies, that we are thinking about them in terms of, you know, who can, you know, not duplicating, not cutting across each other, but actually maximizing the impact of our various, you know, kind of pots of money, and that's in a very strategic way, not just in a sort of day-to-day way as well. You know, and also now thinking about investing in leadership as well. I think this is one of the things that we all fund lots of projects, lots of direct delivery, lots of individual things, but actually thinking about some of that, not in kind of the traditional infrastructure kind of way, but actually thinking genuinely about investing in leadership. I think and leadership that can drive some of that change is hugely important. So I think for us, it's one of the biggest challenges we have to join up those dots and to start kind of talking both, you know, we're doing it through the Northern Ireland Funders Forum, through, you know, in trying to make a better forum for those independent funders to talk to government, and taking that responsibility on ourselves and spreading it widely, I think for me is one of the biggest things one of the biggest responsibilities that we have outside our funding.
Thanks very much indeed, Kate. Kate, have you got any more that you want to know about that, or you want to ask about that, or challenge about that? You're happy enough, grand. Okay, so our next question then is from Johnny Curry.
I actually didn't have a question. Sorry if it looked like I did. Apologies.
Oh, well, then you're going to save us time, Johnny. Many thanks indeed for not having any questions at all. We're all very grateful for you not having any. So we've now got Anna Clark then. Sorry about that, Johnny. Didn't mean to embarrass you. So Anna, is Anna Curry on the line? Anna Clark, rather.
Yes, I'm here, and I'm afraid, Nick, I don't have a question specifically either. I've put lots of comments into the chat, but I haven't specifically indicated with a question, so apologies for that.
Oh, well, I think, in fact, Charlie just prompted me to ask you about community rights.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I did put a comment into the chat that I feel at the heart of a lot of what we're talking about in terms of well-being and shifting the nature of that in our society. It's critical that rights are at the heart of that, and that they're writ large, that they're explicit. And I know Catherine and the other contributors this morning have highlighted the importance of equality and social justice. I think there's a really critical challenge in ensuring that those rights are clearly collectively understood and form the foundation of any development along the lines of what we're talking about. And I'm just interested in how that gets embedded when we have quite a lot of political infrastructure that still supports the issues that create the challenges that we're dealing with, rather than New Zealand, perhaps, which has a Prime Minister that is championing a well-being economy and a well-being society. Thanks.
Thank you. Do you want a quick comment, Catherine?
Yeah, I'll say something really, really briefly, other than I see the sort of rights agenda and the wellbeing agenda as so deeply mutually reinforcing and complementary. In a way, rights are, you know, the foundation, the bedrock on which we build out, you know, towards flourishing in the sense envisaged by wellbeing. They're also such a powerful tool for how we'll hold governments to account for their failure to deliver a wellbeing economy and deliver wellbeing outcomes for people. Last month, I published a report I did for Scotland, looking at what a wellbeing budget for Scotland would entail, and rights, as I imagine they are in Northern Ireland quite a bit, on on the political radar here in Scotland. Scotland's announced that it's going to incorporate the UN CRC into Scottish law. And so I talk a bit in there about, you know, the mutually reinforcing aspect of rights and wellbeing, and also how wellbeing budget has to be profoundly rights-based. And of course, you'll know, Anna, more than I will about how the rights agenda has participation deeply at its core. So how, I mean, that throws open, how do we do policy making? How do we do budget setting? I mean, it's in the context of children's budgeting. This is the report I was doing. How do we make sure children are at their heart of budget setting? I mean, Scotland's relatively okay in terms of consultations and people, you know, the Scottish Parliament's quite porous. Where that's different is in the budget process, which is like this black box that no one understands how it operates and no one can influence vis-a-vis, you know, committees and consultations and the usual sort of process of government decision making. And then yet, as apparently it was Martin Luther King who said, government budgets are moral documents with numbers attached, and yet isn't it so wrong then that that's where when we don't have participation of citizens and communities? So yeah, so I mean, I think rights gives us a really, really powerful lever and accountability framework and sense of obligations on states in which we can help to underpin the creation of a wellbeing economy.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. And just one thing I should mention, I'm sure this is happening anyway, but just to ask Stevie to make sure that we capture the chat, not just the remarks about John Barry's hairstyle, but the you know, the rich discussion and debate that we've had. I've been watching it all along, which is probably why I look like I haven't been paying attention as much as I should, but there's some fantastic insights from everyone there. I was particularly actually recent comments struck by Laurie McCuskers' comment about, you know, the infrastructure that we actually do have in place. I suspect, though I'm open to challenge, that the community sector in Northern Ireland is actually, even though it is exhausting for a lot of people, is actually in a better state than it is elsewhere, with some very good structures and some amazing work that has been done. But in any event, this brings us to the end of our first phase of this morning, and I'd like to thank Kate and Cassie and Catherine for not only for really thoughtful and inspiring speeches, but also for keeping rigidly to time, and indeed all the contributors who've helped with that as well. So we're now on to the workshops, and yes, and I'm going to bring Charlie in to say a few words and to introduce the next part of the session.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Cassie. Thanks, Kate. And thanks for everybody for participating in that conversation. That was really helpful. Look, for me, the breakout sessions are, you know, the core part of this morning's event. And we have six breakout sessions. Our numbers are sort of dwindling, but I still think we've got a significant number of people to participate in these conversations. So there's 5 community leaders, and Peter Doran and Catherine are going to lead the conversation on a wellbeing hub. So we'll maybe just give it 30 minutes rather than 40 minutes, but I think equally it's an opportunity for everybody that remains in the room to be part of that conversation. We really do want to get, you know, your thoughts and your ideas around, you know, what needs to be done to address many of the challenges we face here. And we've taken from Cassie's civil society approach. So our focus is around thriving and powerful communities, adaptive and resilient communities, coping with crisis, or community infrastructure, shaping the future, imagining the future, and establishing a wellbeing hub. So if you give us 30 minutes in that, then we come back, we do a quick report back, and we'll be able to close things down. So thanks for bearing with us. And Stevie, can I hand over to you and let you just allocate people to the various breakout rooms? Thanks.
Thanks very much, everybody, for coming back so promptly, even though you had no choice. We're about to get feedback from you all, but just before we do, Cassie Robinson has to do another presentation at 1 o'clock elsewhere. So I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of everybody, Cassie, and hope that in the future be able to talk with us again. So thank you very much.
No, thanks for having me. And sorry I can't stay right till the end, but I look forward to hearing what came out of everyone's conversation. And yeah, hopefully this is the first of many things like this. So take care, everyone.
Thank you, Cassie.
Cassie.
So what we want to do now, please, is I need to emphasize that we will have recorded and we will do a full report on all the workshops, as well as the speeches and questions. So really, if we could just have 2 or 3 very quick bullet points from each of the workshops, I'll cue you in. So 2 or 3 bullet points, and also if you could all say whether you have an appetite or not for furthering the work in the section that you're involved in, if that makes sense. And then after that, we'll hand over to Charlie for some final reflections. So if we could start with Kate, please, from Thriving and Powerful Communities.
Kate's still here. There she is. Kate.
Yeah. Hi, Charlie.
Hi, Kate, we're just taking feedback from your workshop.
Okay, so I suppose when we talked about how we would have thriving and powerful communities, the first thing we said was you need to build relationships at a local level, and that's building strong relationships at a local level, as we saw during the pandemic. There's a need for education to give knowledge to communities around the data and resources that they have to build on what's in their community and what the deficits and assets are in their community. Enabling communities to agitate and not being afraid to agitate, enabling them to organise. And then this idea that it should all be underpinned by care and compassion. It should be, because that's what thrived in the pandemic, was that we did care and we did have compassion. And that was shown, the love for the NHS was shown because they gave care and compassion. So this idea about the power doesn't lie with other people, but the power lies with individuals. But in order to harness that, we need to remove barriers to people becoming involved. And that's about freeing up time for people to be volunteers. And that's creative thinking around tax breaks, 4-day weeks, all of that. But it's relationship, education, agitate, organise and enable.
Thank you very much indeed, Kate. And if I can move on now, please, to adaptive and resilient communities. Who was the rapporteur from there, and can you give us some reflections?
Thanks, Nick. Sarah Houston from the Lottery is going to feed back on our conversation under that theme.
Yeah, so I suppose we kind of only got onto the second question, but our main points from the first question were just looking, which was around how to support communities to adapt and build resilience post-COVID. So the main point coming out of that was around starting with existing and new structures that have sprung up organically since COVID, that those have seemed to be working well and people are enjoying working on those structures. But the other thing then was to flip that question around, and that communities are resilient and they do adapt. So how can we encourage the system to change to support communities in this? And then the other main point then was just around that community infrastructure is largely strong, but it's not necessarily even. And where it exists, that's essential. But where we need to do is look at the gaps in terms of the lower capacity areas, as that leaves wider communities vulnerable.
Thank you very much indeed. The next one I have here on the list is community infrastructure.
Anna.
Hi, yes. Sian Williams from the Lottery is going to do the feedback for us.
Thank you.
Oh, there she is. Great.
Yeah, hi. So yeah, we were thinking about how do we better understand the infrastructure that's needed. So there was a lot of talk about how pre-COVID there was a focus on physical community spaces like halls and leisure centres, and then an idea about kind of flipping this around and thinking about bringing the work to communities and villages, and also rethinking sort of generic community space. So you could have spaces where it acts as a kind of village catalyst with co-working space, childcare facilities, and bringing together a range of different kind of services. There was also the thought about how to bring in the business sector, and that perhaps that's kind of been neglected a little bit in the past, and actually there are a lot of lessons and commonalities across the voluntary and business sectors. So there was a need to kind of build on that understanding. And then inevitably we got on to talking about digital and how to sort of transfer the good that has come from online working and the gains that have been made there, but also thinking about what the barriers are. So one was about needing high-speed broadband, particularly in rural areas, addressing digital poverty through providing hardware, but also some of the things that get a bit forgotten. So the need to provide the knowledge, skills, and confidence as well. And again, sort of thinking about what other buildings and organizations can help with this. So businesses, libraries can all be used to educate people, because sometimes that's needed at a very basic level to ensure.
I think if you don't mind, just to get, because I'm determined to finish on time, and we won't lose anything from your workshop because it's all being captured anyway. So thank you very much. The next one I have is communities shaping the future.
Okay, I'll quickly a couple of points, and then if Abigail wants to chip in. Basically, the focus was how do we grow our power as citizens to actually get stuff done, and the key focus was about being really clear about where we need to start the conversations. So I shared a metaphor from John McKnight, which was around the 3 motorways. The first lane is what citizens can do for themselves. The second lane is what citizens need institutions to do things with, and the third lane is institutions need to get on and do that job. And the problem is we always start the conversation often in lane 3 rather than actually what citizens are doing and can do for themselves. And I suppose lastly, we kind of just talked about weaving the scaffolding. The stuff is there, we know what the answers are, we know what the solutions are, we just need to do a weaving task and weave a scaffolding that actually shifts us forward. Abigail, is there anything you want to add?
No, I think that captures it perfectly. Just, yeah, we finish with observations about need to build trust and to overcome our tendency to compete and to try and collaborate more. But yeah, that was, I think you captured it nicely, Karen, thanks.
Yeah, and thanks, Karen, that was really, really well put, I thought. Communities coping with crisis?
That was my group, but Michael's going to feed back on our behalf.
Right. I suppose we looked at pre-COVID and looked at the disconnect between the government's purpose and what the community's purposes are in terms of that. Even funders as well, sometimes the funding streams are to meet the needs of a funder rather than to meet the needs of a community, and that has to change. It's constantly a threat that hangs over groups. However, moving into a new type of era, I suppose, which has been brought about by the pandemic, has realized for people that there are different models and things that actually work in terms of the healthy living alliances and the healthy living centres. We're able to have a different type of role to encourage people to embrace nature and well-being and social outputs, but more importantly, they were able to be that bridge for people who felt disempowered because of all this. Equally, we took into consideration that a lot of roles as a response to COVID have changed. So for instance, in the likes of youth clubs, youth workers are now trying to take on counselling roles and thinking of other roles that actually can meet the needs of where they're actually at. And I suppose the model that was used from some of the local authorities and government departments was to actually go to the communities and say to them, look, listen, I think one of the terms was we just bit off what we needed. We didn't actually take, and that was the option that was given to people. What do you think that you can deliver? Rather than people trying to shoehorn into different things. And so the government approach, if it was able to play to the flexibility of communities,
would be far more appreciated. Some of the biggest concerns then, it's in the question 2, was that as a result of us jumping into Zoom and digital solutions to these things, there are concerns around the mother and toddler groups. Older people groups actually have embraced Zoom, but now that has reinforced their fear about coming back out into the community again. And we need to have some type of befriending social approach and a different perspective. We were also reminded as well that chasing money all the time to do these things is not healthy. It doesn't contribute to well-being. And we have there are other models that are based on more social models and not about being driven by paid salaried workers and all the rest to actually deliver some of the social outcomes that we need.
Michael, that's great. A really interesting insight about people coming off Zoom and back into the outdoor world. Oh, and congratulations on the background, by the way. It's if we were awarding a prize for the best background of the day, win it by a country mile.
I'll have to go over and take another photograph of the waterworks on a sunny day. That was taken on the obligatory walk that was permitted by the Assembly.
No, thank you very much. And then we have our extra final one, which is establishing a wellbeing hub. Who's going to speak to that?
Yeah, I'll say a few words about that. We had a number of participants who are involved in the very early stages of working with Katherine and we all to establish a hub, a platform to facilitate, to collaborate and make these connections, identify these relationships and points of influence, so that in a sense it's not displacing any existing activity. It's attempting to amplify and direct some of our attention to the core issue of the dominant economic narrative and revisiting that and trying to influence that in the image of our own aspirations as a community and as a place. We noted that we've been here to some extent before with the work that the Carnegie Trust and the School of Law carried out with the senior civil service, civil society and academics. So the door is open in the sense that we began to do some of the early work in terms of measurement and outcomes and indicators. But there was one observation that is still, it hasn't led to the coherence. There's still a fragmented and an experience of competing methods and approaches to measuring outcomes and establishing a common purpose. So I think the main observation then was that we need to also respect that this is an invitation to discern, respect, audit and map so much of what is already happening in our communities, in the sector, but also beyond and in the private sector as well. That's beginning to think about the purpose, to repurposing the economy, taking ownership and democratizing and making accountable the economy. And there's a need to discern and gather that energy as well, and not forget that there are organizations like the Collaboration for Change, but also the work that DT and I are doing as well, of course. And this is about maybe establishing new connections, relocating ourselves within a global movement, a global vision, but intensifying the learning and the drawing down of knowledge that can maybe challenge us as well in some of our own habits as a sector. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Peter, and thank you to everyone for crisp feedback from the groups. I'm going to hand over to Charlie very shortly, just to wrap up. Before I do, I'd like to thank Kate and Katherine, who are still on the call. Thanked and Cassie before for really illuminating and fascinating talks, which I think has sparked a really interesting debate in this room and elsewhere. And I, for one, would love to see this continued and pushed forward. So, Charlie, over to you.
You want to meet Nick? Thanks very much, Nick. I suppose my first thanks goes to all of you for giving us your time and for sticking with us to 1 o'clock. I really do appreciate it. It's been quite valuable 2.5 hours certainly for Development Trust NI and the work that we've been doing on behalf of our members and wider civil society in terms of local economy and wealth building. So I think there's a ton of information that has been gleaned from presentations and from the chat room conversations. I would ask that the note takers, rapporteurs for the workshops, if they can forward us their notes, that would be great. And what we will do is we will be developing a conference report, and we will actually share our interpretation of that conference report with the workshop facilitators and note takers in advance as well, to make sure we're making an accurate reflection of the conversations that you had there. And so I think for me, it's on behalf of DTNI, it's a thanks to Katherine Trebeck. I think Katherine obviously was the draw here today, not me, but which is brilliant. You know what I mean? Thanks to Kate Beggs and to Cassie and their colleagues, the National Lottery, for agreeing to participate in this session with us. That was really fantastic. Thanks to our community leaders, to Kate, to Karen, to Johnny, to Gillian, to Anna, who came in at the last moment, and to Peter for his work. And then thanks to the note takers, the rapporteurs, to Beth, to Sarah, to Michael, to Shan, Abigail, and then to Mary, who came in laterally as well. And then I suppose thanks also goes out to my own colleagues, Margaret and Stevie, and to Amanda Doherty, who was instrumental in terms of helping us pull this thing together. I did say at the outset, I mean, it's a conversation that we've been having for the past number of years, and it's a conversation we're trying to move into a different space. And I think for us, it's critical that community voice is very much, part of, leading and shaping, what needs to happen, what needs to change going forward. So we look to identify the key themes of interest from all of the things that we've talked about this morning, and we will come back to you in that. Ideally, what we would like to do is focus further on some of those themes and maybe use the methodology that the civil society approach has adopted for its investigation across the UK. So we will be back in contact. We think that there is a need to continue the conversation going forward. We are also interested in the Wellbeing Hub and seeing how we can advance that conversation here on the island as well. So finally, that's it from me. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your patience with the tech. I look forward to speaking to you all again soon. Thanks.
Thank you, Charlie.